This is the Hours to Embrace Climate Federalism event, hosted and put together by the Civic Alliance for Cooler Rhode Island. And today we're going to be talking about the interplay between federal action on climate change and the state policy that many of us on this call are working on. So thank you so much for joining, and we're excited to be talking about this today. We have a great list of speakers. First, to give a little bit of background on what has been going on. Between January 28th and January 27th of this year, President Biden signed 7 directives that included different executive orders, executive actions, and a couple of fact sheets on climate change. For the first time, we're seeing climate action, climate policy, environmental justice be a center of the policies of the federal administration. And that has really big impacts here in Rhode Island on what we are able to do with our climate policy and on the action that we're able to take, which we'll learn about today. My name is Kai Salem. I am the policy coordinator at Green Energy Consumers Alliance, where I work to advance state climate policy in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, and I'm the VP of policy at the Environment Council of Rhode Island. I'll be moderating this session. It's an hour-long session titled Hours to Embrace, and our speakers include Sue Anderbois, Barry Rabe, Ken Payne, Timmons Roberts, and Kurt Spalling. I'll introduce each of them briefly before they present. The session is recorded, as Timmons mentioned earlier, and so you'll be able to share that with folks afterwards, or you can just review it at your own leisure. There will also be supporting documents, references, and Biden's directives on the livableRI.org website. And that address should be on the slide. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat box on this Zoom call. If we have time at the end, we'll go through them and try to answer a few of them. Finally, if you have any technical issues, you can call or text the phone number that is on the slides, although I don't see the slides up right now, so maybe someone can copy that phone number in the chat so that you all have it, and technical help will get back to you. The presentation is produced by the Civic Alliance for Cooler Rhode Island. Civic Alliance for Cooler Rhode Island is a Rhode Island grassroots all-volunteer organization. You can find out more at livableRI.org. And I'll just mention that I cannot take any credit for the work putting together this symposium, although I'm really glad to be a part of it. Finally, we'll get started. Our first presenter today is Ken Payne. Ken has served as Executive Director of the Rhode Island League of Cities and Towns, Federal Projects Coordinator for U.S. Senator Claiborne Pell, and Senior Policy Advisor to the Rhode Island Senate. His fingerprints are all over Rhode Island's existing great climate and environmental policy, and he's an expert on so much of what Rhode Island has already done when it comes to climate and energy policy. He is now the president of the Civic Alliance for a Cooler Rhode Island and the lead contributor to this program. You can read Ken's detailed analysis of Biden's executive orders on the livableRI.org website. And a copy will also be sent out to those who have registered for this program. If you did not register and would like a copy, send your request and your email address into the chat box. Ken, I will leave it up to you to introduce us in this program. And the question that we are here today, or would like to have you answer today, is why are the actions by this president so important and necessary?
Great, I'll do that. And I'd like to thank everybody who is in on the Zoom. It's thrilling to have you involved. Thank you too to Paul, Julie, Ray, and Timmons, who did the work of pulling this together. I am excited by what's up. First of all, the stunning inauguration poem by Amanda Gorham. And then that evening as well, Executive Order 13990 on protecting public health and the environment, resting on science to tackle climate change. Wow. And a week later, January 27th, 2 more executive orders and a presidential memorandum on restoring trust in government through scientific integrity and evidence-based policymaking. An unprecedented suite of actions. Executive Order 14008, tackling climate change, the climate crisis at home and abroad. Huge. Building on the Paris Agreement, advancing sustainable development, creating well-paying union jobs and clean energy future, achieving net zero emissions by no later than 2050, conserving 30% of US lands and waters by 2030, securing environmental justice, comprehensively updating the Clinton Executive Order on 12898. All of this, very exciting. And I would say after years and years of federal doldrums on these issues, finally a fresh wind that we can catch, and to do more for Rhode Island to move forward. But we have to embrace the opportunity. It's something that we either use it or lose it. So let's embrace this. How to understand the content of all the what's taking place. I think it be reduced to four, in a way, figures, symbols, what have you. First, a T, horizontal at the top, is interagency coordination. That's in all these things. It's presumed that the federal government will not be stepping on its own toes, that will be horizontally integrated. Second, vertical activity, up and down the spectrum of government, down to the local level, tribal level, and state level. It's vertical and as well as horizontal. Next, a triangle. Equity, ecology, and economy in the three corners. The key pieces of the Paris Agreement, all throughout, meeting the Paris Agreement, meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. Next, a straight line, a temporal dimension, 4 years of Biden and then 50 years of ongoing work to get to net zero, a circle, which involves a strong effort on all of our parts to engage in carbon sequestration. Absolutely essential. So there we have it. Four figures, a T, a triangle, the line of time, and the circle of net zero, leading us back to our own ecosystem. This place where we live, where it is up to us now to think globally as well as act locally. That's how we achieve climate change federalism. So there, in a nutshell, briefly stated, is the measure of these very big actions by President Biden coming out of the box in the first week of his administration. And now I'll turn it over to Kai and the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. Next up is Barry Rabe, the Harris Family Professor at the Gerald Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan, where he examines the political feasibility of adopting and implementing climate policy in federal systems. His most recent books include Trump, the Administrative Presidency and Federalism, and Can We Price Carbon? Barry, thanks for being here. The question that we'd like you to consider is, there's so much division in this country and distrust of science and the federal government, as well as so many roadblocks at the federal level. Biden's executive orders fully embrace science and call out to the entire federal government to help in the climate crisis. Can the federal government get this done?
First of all, Kai, thank you and everyone for inviting me to join you today. I'm just delighted to be part of this. And you identify a really challenging question. I wish I could just say, yes, there's a clear path forward, and I'm absolutely confident that this is what the future is going to look like. I have to temper my remarks, but I'll try to kind of provide a little bit of framing and beginning to think about that. This is challenging. And first, I would note that this is not the first moment where the federal government has considered or thought about this issue. Climate change arrived in the executive branch of the federal government in the 1970s. Congressional hearings on this began in the 1980s. And without going into too much depth, useful to think that we've had some time to work on this. There have been moments where it seemed like the windows were opening up for a Congress or a president to come together. And yet, even before we get to climate change, I am mindful that in recent decades, we've had every possible part of partisan control of the presidency and different chambers in Congress imaginable. And yet it has now been 31 years since we've seen any reauthorization of the Clean Air Act. 34 years since any reauthorization of the Clean Water Act, and 37 years since any reauthorization of hazardous waste legislation. So that's a daunting gap to fill, and I do think the congressional path or legislative route is really important. I deeply appreciate certainly all that Ken has done over the course of his career on this policy issue in Rhode Island, as well as his thoughtful comments before me on executive orders. And I think these can be very significant in providing a foundation. But I think we've also learned over this 30 or so year period, in many respects, executive action through an executive order or rulemaking processes is quite limited unless one can be confident that it will control the presidency for 3 or 4 or 5 consecutive elections. As we saw in the Obama administration, numerous executive orders, aggressive ways to look at every possible component of the Clean Air Act and retrofit it to climate were largely reversed over the actions of the last 4 years in the Trump administration, many states that aggressively opposed these actions in court, and then a series of court decisions. And so obviously what Ken says is right, and there is this new foundation and opportunity, and it's challenging. And we've also seen, and I hate to say this is true of my own state of Michigan, a lack of constructive engagement. We have not seen in many states what has been happening in Rhode Island for some time to really proactively and creatively think about the future and laying models that could be bases for future federal policy. This is challenging, and there will be states, and there will be representatives of states, certainly in the Senate, who will likely oppose many policy options because of immediate impacts in their own state, including production and use of fossil fuels. And yet, I do think there really is a remarkable foundation in what so many of the leading early actors, including Rhode Island, have begun to pursue. And this is why I think, in response to your question, Kai, there really is an opportunity over this next year or 18 months to think systematically and bring forces together to design a package that not only could get pushed through Congress, but could be operated in a timely way, might build constituency support over time, and really be developed. And part of what gives me hope is so much of what's being proposed in Washington now is not just based on theory, but on what one or more states have actually done. Here, I'm mindful that what we're hearing about a proposal to combine a clean energy standard or portfolio standard with energy efficiency is something that a large number of states, including Rhode Island, have been doing for some time. The idea of an investment-based strategy is something that the RGGI states, including Rhode Island, have been doing for quite some time and are thinking about in the transportation area. And so there's some real possibilities here. Ironically, some of the greatest growth in the actual siting and production of energy from wind and solar are taking place in red states who may not believe in climate change, but certainly want to pursue the economic development opportunities. And I think we also are poised to make some real advances in the non-carbon dioxide greenhouse gases like HFCs or hydrofluorocarbons, methane, CH4, and some of the others, as long as we can find ways to develop a funding mechanism. And I personally think we're going to come back to carbon pricing in some way, much as you have done in the Northeast. This can be significant. Last point, something I never would have expected to say a few years ago, but look at what Canada has done. A federal system that gives almost total authority to provinces, has routinely had problems passing climate legislation over 30 years, regardless of which policy is in control, has created a carbon pricing mechanism that is going to $50 a ton by 2022. Last year, the 5 political parties, 4 of them supporting that policy, got 64% of the vote in a federal election. And now the Prime Minister, Mr. Trudeau, has proposed using that as a model and going not just to $50 a ton, but by the end of the decade, $170 a ton, with some very creative ideas and strategies for returning and using that revenue in individual provinces and territories. And so I think if you look at what so many of our states have been able to do, our Canadian neighbors have been able to do, as well as some of the opportunities, particularly if it is drawn from real experience, real best practice, things that have worked in various jurisdictions. I'm increasingly hopeful, Kai, that my answer to your question will be even more and more affirmative in the months ahead. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Barry. Next up is Kurt Spalling, a professor at the Institute at Brown for Environment and Society. He is the former US EPA Region 1 administrator here in New England, and also the former executive director of Save the Bay. Kurt is also a contributor to the recently released study titled Towards a Resilient Providence by the Providence Resilience Partnership. This study is also available at the Livable RI website, along with the other materials for today's presentation. Kurt, Barry outlined what the federal government can and cannot do, and some of our remaining questions. You sat in that seat taking direction from the federal government and prodding the states to act. State agencies act based on state and federal authority. How well did Rhode Island use their authority to act when you held that position? What was the interplay between states and the federal level, and what can we do to make sure things work really well under the current administration?
Well, thank you, Kai, and hello, everybody, and thank you to both Barry and Ken for setting this up. I'm going to dive deeply into sort of how does it really work? How does federalism kind of come together as it's been described? Because as much as we all talk about what might need to change, we need to recognize there's a vast system of environmental management out there with probably more than 30,000 people at state, federal, and local level, all collaborating might not be the right word, somehow coordinating to create policy and essentially what is described as cooperative federalism. I put a couple of slides together just to help me stay on track so I don't wander into spaces that you probably don't need to know. But I thought I'd try to get to these 3 questions very quickly. How does cooperative federalism really work for the practice of environmental management? So how does this really, how does EPA and the state, or how does EPA push the state, or how do they get together on policy? What are the resources that, in fact, I can't read my own screen here because of the boxes, but how has the performance partnership system responded to resource constraints? And also, what are the innovations that seem to be emerging around what we're doing? First of all, you need to understand that federal statutes and offices, Barry alluded to it, a lot of this work was set up way back in the 80s and 90s, and even before that, 70s and 80s. So a lot of what you're seeing is a system that was built way back then when people understood pollution to be the primary problem. So you had emphasis of air, water, chemical safety, pollution prevention, land and emergency management. These are siloed programs at EPA that push right down into state offices. So you have, again, state offices, similarly by the same name, air, water enforcement, you know them. How are they funded? Well, there's authorizations, there's government, congressional committees that authorize funding, and appropriation committee, and then grants to states. All of this is a very complicated process that I was assigned to administer running EPA New England. And each of those programs push down with a set of priorities that come from in fact, the White House. So a lot has been discussed about these executive orders and what they mean. What they really mean is the bureaucracies of the federal government are going to use tools like this to coordinate with states and try to create policy or policy change through this executive function. It turns out that EPA New England was perhaps the best region in the country in terms of using this performance partnership system, or the NEP system, to try to get this coordination going. And so in fact, some of the things that are highlighted in the Biden EOs are actually already in place in New England. For example, our region was considered a leading region on environmental justice, and you saw action in Massachusetts several years ago, executive orders and the likes. All of that came from dialogue. But what is this performance partnership really meant to do? It's meant to break down silos and be able to work across these programs and try to be strategic, integrate state and federal strategies. It's very important to realize, and we just heard this, that our states have very good strategies. And so now we need to integrate them with the federal government. This is the system for doing it. Now that's all the good news. The bad news is, and in my time and before that, we have seen a tremendous disinvestment in our environmental management system. It happened in the States right before I jumped in 2010. Then the 2010 Congress was elected, and EPA's funding started to get constrained very severely, literally held level for all the years during the Obama administration. I could go into detail on all that, but it's not really necessary. The point is, we have a resource constraint situation, but an expanding demand situation. So how are we going to cope with that? It's just the way it is as we speak. So just to get centered on this, I went back and looked at the most recent performance partnership agreement between Rhode Island and EPA, October 16th to 2019. So this is after I served, but I note there's a big gap before that. It was one of my priorities to try to get one in place, and it happened shortly after I left. Good, that's good. So what do we see in the current agreement? We see some of what Biden is talking about in executive orders. We do see an environmental justice commitment. And in Rhode Island DEM, they laid out very specifically how they want to do that. I think if you look at that title down there, Title 6, that's an important piece, very complicated, but the bottom line is you see a commitment to environmental justice. And that was not there prior to this agreement. This is just an example of how cooperative federalism will work, how these things will go forward. More disappointing, I couldn't find Appendix A, it's probably somewhere, that would give me detail on how all these performance commitments would be made up. But this is the system. There's a negotiation between the EPA Regional Office and Rhode Island DEM, and that's across all the federal programs. So I expect you'd see the same thing into the other federal programs like DOT and the like. So here's some observations. And this is sort of the things that I think matter. You know, where's Rhode Island in this whole complexity of a system that we have that is supposed to deliver environmental services, and now the big sea change of climate change coming in and affecting how that system works. Well, we need to recognize that Rhode Island is leading on resource decline. And I don't think I'm offending anyone at DEM. It was generally recognized that Rhode Island's resources were thinner than any of the other New England states. Lean is an acronym for a process to try to make more efficient everything you do, get rid of the wasted time and space that you do things with. That was in response to these resource constraints. But the bottom line is we're walking into a very demanding situation with a history of resource decline. On environmental justice, which is so important, we see progress in Rhode Island, but it's behind Massachusetts. It's not as robust. It isn't something the governor stood up and said something about. There's no executive order per se, but it is there. And I think it's important to recognize it. And it's really come in the last 3-4 years. Rhode Island on data and data transparency and the kinds of things you see in other states that was built into these performance partnership agreements. Not so much, there's work, but compared to some of the other states, especially Massachusetts, which is really pioneering work on setting up portals and transparency so people can see environmental performance down to the specific firm level, not so good, not so much. Structure. Rhode Island passed the big structure change that Connecticut and Massachusetts did, where they pulled environmental management and energy together. So we don't have integrated structure in terms of our bureaucracy. We still have separate authorities between DEM and CRMC. Is that sustainable now? I don't know. I know there's overlapping authorities. And then finally on climate itself, We've seen some new things in our neighboring states. Vermont and Maine have started new climate councils, which are positioned at the governor's level with stakeholder participation from academic and leadership business and leadership civic stakeholders, environmental justice interests and the like. So we see a governance system that is inclusive of those groups. We see resilience programs that starting in Vermont were very robust. Vermont managed to do a state resiliency plan in 6 months, which took Rhode Island 2 years to do, or 3 years to do. So we see leadership, or we're a little behind on resiliency work. I can talk more detail about that later. And while the Act of Climate is a fantastic outcome and is modeled on what's going on in Massachusetts, it's not recourses, I'm sorry, it's resources. There's an issue of resources. Again, I keep coming back to that. Rhode Island is more resource constrained than everywhere. And finally, in the EC4 context, EC4 was actually set up under the Chafee administration. Is this the right tool now for the coordination and integration we now see or need to see? That's a huge question also. So I'll wrap up with that, but I will say that the bottom line is there's a big system out there. It needs to be modified and modernized and silos broken down. And then these big questions that are being raised by the Biden administration addressed through EPA and DEM and other agency actions.
Thank you, Kurt. And your focus on resource decline and how important it is that our state agencies can actually do what we're asking them to do is important. And next up, we have someone with lots of experience at the state level. Sue Anderwatt is the Climate and Energy Program Manager at the Nature Conservancy. But before that, Sue was Rhode Island's first Director of Food Strategy. So she has lots of experience both as an advocate on climate and energy and also as someone who works for the state. Currently, Sue is the chair of the Providence Environmental Sustainability Task Force, a board member of my organization, Green Energy Consumers Alliance, also the Southside Community Land Trust, and Farm to Institution New England. Sue is also a founding board member of a new organization called the Local Return, which is dedicated to creating community wealth and supporting the things that make Rhode Island special. So Sue, from your perspective as a state advocate and someone who focuses on state policy, how do you see Rhode Island taking part in Biden's executive orders?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kai, for that question, and to Ken and others for putting this together. I'm really excited to be here. So there are a lot of things that excite me about Biden's executive orders and how they could land here in Rhode Island. I'm going to touch on two in particular and kind of talk through them and would love to continue this conversation. So the two that I'm going to talk through, one are the climate justice and environmental justice as essential pieces of climate action, and then also the 30 by 30 goal, which Ken discussed earlier. So I'll start with the 30 by 30 goal. So Biden released early an executive order that 30% of the land and water in America will be conserved by 2030, which is a huge and ambitious goal. Sitting at a land conservation organization, it gets me so excited because land and water conservation is, I think, as a longtime climate advocate, a forgotten piece of our climate story. So I'm looking at my notes is what I'm looking at. You guys can't see that, but I want to make sure I don't forget anything. And when you first hear the 30 by 30 goal, I imagine for a lot of folks, it might conjure up these images of these like vast tracts of open space, like maybe some of the big national monuments out west or things like that. But open space and green space, forests, they're vital here in Rhode Island too, even though we are so densely populated. In fact, I might even say that they might feel more vital given how small we are. It always surprises me to remember that Rhode Island is about 50% 50% forested. And that also most of that forest land, or a good portion of that forest land, is privately owned. So that's people owning a couple acres here, a couple acres there, 50 acres here, 50 acres there. So a lot of that forest land is owned by individuals and families and not currently conserved. But trees and forests do a number of really important things beyond just existing, which I always like to just say out loud, like things can exist without an economic purpose. But some of the really important things that they do for us include stormwater management, carbon sequestration, carbon storage, air filtration, important wildlife habitat, wildlife connection corridors, cooling of the air, and so much more. And forests are under threat in Rhode Island from all sorts of development. So I won't go into all the different types of development that they're under threat from, but that also includes renewable energy and renewable energy siting. So as we think about how 30 by 30 lands here in Rhode Island and how it lands across the world, thinking about how we create policies and expand policies that help us move toward thoughtful siting of not just renewables, but all forms of development, so that we can be thinking about all the different elements we'll need as we become more climate resilient. So it's really exciting to think of this 30 by 30 goal and what that means in Rhode Island, especially as such a small, densely populated state, and the important roles that forests and open space can have in our climate resilience, and not leave that out of the conversation. So I was excited to see that signed, in the same pen stroke, using the same cross pen made in Rhode Island as these other initiatives. The other piece that I think lands really importantly in Rhode Island and really needs to ramp up, and Kurt alluded to this as well, or mentioned it as well, but the climate justice and addressing environmental racism as a really key centering of our climate activism and our climate policy is vital. We all know, I hope, that the people who are bearing the worst impacts of our climate crisis are generally the ones who've done the least to cause it, and also have benefited the least from the things that have caused the climate crisis. And that's not something that's happening far away. That's not, in foreign countries. That's what's happening. That's happening right here. That's happening in Providence. That's happening in Rhode Island. And for folks who are in Providence, for example, you really don't have to look any further than the Port of Providence to see, high concentration of polluting industry that's situated in a residential neighborhood that's primarily Black, Indigenous, and people of color, or frontline communities of color. That is not situated here on the East Side where I live, surrounded by brown professors and people who work at Miriam Hospital. And there are reasons for that. Those are environmental racism reasons. I really want to highlight Providence's climate justice plan and the really amazing work of the Office of Sustainability and the Racial and Environmental Justice Committee. That plan really recognized kind of the history and generation of racist policy kind of across the state and across our country that led to some of that led, directly and indirectly to what's happening, and really centered our response as a city to the climate crisis on frontline communities of color. So they didn't use it as here's one lens we're looking through, or here's something that's important but might be outweighed by something else, or great, we talked to a few folks from those communities, but what we're really focused on is this other thing. They really centered that strategy or that plan on strategies that would address racial and environmental justice, and really led the planning effort through the partnership with the Racial and Environmental Justice Committee. So it's really community driven. It also focuses a lot on cumulative impacts. So when we think about how things land here in Rhode Island, I think we're often set up to look at kind of spot impacts of things, oh, something's emitting this right now, as opposed to over time, this community has felt this impact, or people's bodies have absorbed this quantity of pollution because they've been in this place for so long. And so in Biden putting climate justice and environmental justice so far up on his agenda, I think it really sets the stage for us. I mean, I was also really excited to see him put climate change in general as one of his top priorities and see it in this kind of de-siloed way. And I think having climate justice be up there as well, we can see that it's not just, oh, here's the climate justice silo, or here's the climate change silo, but this impacts transportation policy. This, impacts the Treasury and commerce and all of the agencies that I don't think have had to think about themselves and with these lenses on. And we can see that kind of filter down. I'm excited to see how that can filter down here in Rhode Island, and how we can kind of cause that to filter down here in Rhode Island, so that agencies and policymakers who haven't really had to think about these issues before realize the vital role that their agencies play in helping us solve the climate crisis. So super excited as always, and I'll turn it back to Kai.
Thank you, Sue, and thank you for emphasizing the importance of weaving in justice and equity into our approach to climate policy in Rhode Island at the federal level. It's something that's been great to see that Biden has prioritized, and I think Rhode Island could still stand to learn from that and also go beyond what they're doing at the federal level. Before I move on to our final speaker, Timmons Roberts, this is the next presentation will be the last opportunity to put questions in the chat box. We will have time to address some of the questions at the end. Thank you to our speakers for staying within their time. So make sure to put in your questions in the chat box so that we can discuss. So Timmons is the Idelson Professor of Environmental Studies and Sociology at Brown University. He has taught in and directed environmental science and policy programs at Brown, and before that at the College of William and Mary and at Tulane University. His most recent work is on who is lobbying for and against climate change initiatives, why isn't climate policy more effective, and or well, really, why are climate policy campaigns not more effective here in Rhode Island and Massachusetts. He wrote the 2019 Deeper Decarbonization in the Ocean State, 2019 Rhode Island Greenhouse Gas Reduction Study. And Timmons was my professor at Brown and helped get me started on Rhode Island climate policy. So I'm so appreciative of all the work that he has done in the climate activism community here in Rhode Island. So Timmons, your background is as both a social scientist as well as a climate change scientist. And political science seems to be a big thread of your work, even though I know that you started in biology. So in your view, where does science play? What's the role of science in climate policy when a lot of the arguments are really emotional? And how are we capable of using science to make the type of changes that are necessary and suggested in the president's executive orders?
Thank you, Kai, and it's really great. This panel's just rocking it. I want to thank everybody who's speaking, and thank everybody who's coming, and the Citizens Alliance for Cooler Rhode Island for organizing this, and Ken Payne especially for writing this document. I mean, we have really needed this kind of a summary of what's going on with the, with these executive orders and what they mean for our states. So you're really asking me about science and the best available science. As Ken points out in this document and is often, referenced in plans and in our legislation and in executive orders, is that we need to use the best available science. I hope you're seeing a slide. I don't know, I have so many screens on here now, showing the sort of, if we're going to stay under 1.5 degrees of warming, which of course is the sort of stretch goal under the Paris Agreement, this is the rate of reductions that we need under different years. It shows just how fast best available science is changing or needs to change. Does this make sense? So if we had started in 2011 globally, really reducing our emissions, we could have done so at 3.7% a year. If we had started back in 1990, as Barry Rabe mentioned earlier, we could have been reducing at 1% a year or maybe even less. And now we're at the point now in 2021 where we need to be reducing at 9% a year, our carbon emissions. And I don't mean this to be overwhelming, but I do mean is that one of the problems with legislation at any level, federal, state, is that they often lock in the science and from the period that they're from. And that's been the problem with the 80% emissions reduction goals that were by 2050, which are just so common in even the most ambitious states in the US. And now we finally are moving beyond those, including this Saturday with the signing by our governor of the Act on Climate, groundbreaking landmark legislation for our state. We now have binding emissions reduction targets, which include net zero in 2050 and 45% by 2030. So that is much more in line with the science. Is it in line with the science here? I mean, this shows us really having to go to zero by 2040 if we're going to stay under 1.5 degrees. So there is going to be difficulty in really deciding what is the sort of consensus of the scientific community. About 98% of climate scientists believe there is this problem with climate change, but the problem is the 2% is highly amplified, and I think that's where the politics comes in. So here, let's see if I can get my next slide to run here. in the US, whenever there's a risk of climate legislation, there's a boom in spending for lobbying. This is research by Robert Brule, who's my co-director here at the Climate Social Science Network, which we have headquartered at Brown. It's a global network now. And it shows, he has shown really this just boom in spending, at each sign of movement, up to from below 50 million a year to 350 million a year, when there was the risk of the Waxman-Markey bill in late, in 2009, 2010. So that's just to make the point that there is often quite an imbalance. He found the balance was about 9-to-1 in spending by those in favor of climate action to the spending by fossil fuel interests. And I think this imbalance in capacity would be my biggest point here, that Kurt Spalling mentioned sort of the cuts to the Department of Environmental Management and to our environmental management overall. And I would say just in general, our state agencies who are tasked with carrying out this legislation really do lack the capacity. And so we need to make sure that in our management plans, in our spending planning, we need to include funding for those agencies. And I would say it goes all the way down to funding the way they do in California for civil society organizations who are able to then become supported as they appear before the, for example, public utilities commissions or the Air Resources Board and so on. That would be a huge step forward. And I think that's one of the reasons why Providence's environmental justice plan was so different, was because it included right up front funding for civil society organizations to participate. And it's really maintained it for a few years, thanks to, in this case, grant funding. I serve on the Science and Technology Advisory Board of the Executive Climate Change Coordinating Council, right? The EC4, the collection of agency heads across the Rhode Island state government that have been, for 7 years now, since the passage of our 2014 legislation, responsible for carrying out our climate policy in the state. And that Science and Technology Advisory Board is supposed to keep it up to date on the science. And it has really been much more effective in doing that in terms of describing climate risks, that is summarizing the data. It's been entirely under capacity in terms of being able to reflect on the technology or the policy. We don't have enough support in that panel to be able to really say, well, the state is succeeding in this way and failing in other ways. Let me just show you a report in case you're interested in a study we just completed in Massachusetts. We've done similar work in Rhode Island, but haven't finished turning it into a report. So this got released. You can find it at CSSN, this Climate Science Social Science Network .org under reports. And what we did was collected all the information on lobbying and then what legislation they lobbied on. And I just wanted to show you, it sort of shows these different coalitions of groups fighting for and against different legislation. It shows that in general, that there's sort of a green coalition and then an anti-climate legislation. This was just climate legislation. That the utilities are exceedingly important, that the fossil and chemical industries are extremely important. But the slide that I want to get to is the next one, which shows what happens to legislation. And it really shows this is just about the utilities, and they're such an important and powerful lobbying force. And this is, I'm using Massachusetts as an example, largely because they have some of the very best lobbying records in the country. There's about 5 states that have this level of detail. And what it shows is on the left is the total bills that are introduced into the system. I call this the fish ladder. So a lot of fish enter the ladder, they get caught under the falls, and very few fish make it even to the Ways and Means committees in the Senate and the House. And of those ones, you'll notice that it'll be, these are the green ones are the ones that the utilities were in favor of. The red ones were the ones they were against. They reported neutral on these blue bills, and then they didn't lobby on the others. But you can see that by the time we get through the fish ladder, very few fish are getting through, And in fact, over the, I think about 160 bills we had back down here, only about 6 or 7 end up being signed. And of those, the utilities have largely rewritten them or helped get them rewritten in these really important committees. So my big point here is that there's a very large imbalance in expertise, that there's a need to make sure that we really are following the latest science, but that it's not going to be easy. We have to make sure that it doesn't get locked in at the time when the legislation's passed. So in the interest of time, I'm going to pass it back to Kai. Thanks.
Thank you, Timmons. Looks like we're definitely going to have time for questions. So, and that time is now. So everyone, please put your questions in the chat and we will start going through some of them. But first, thank you to all of our presenters this afternoon for sharing some of your expertise and also for staying on time so that we have time for some discussion. I'm going to mention some of the questions and it will be open to all of you to jump in and start answering them unless there was someone specifically named in the question. So first, I'd like to ask about transportation. Faith and Ro Lobassier asked, on a basic level, we're spending a lot of money on infrastructure, and when people say infrastructure, they often mean roads and bridges. Is the federal government incorporating pedestrian travel and alternative transportation when they say infrastructure? And how can we make sure that those modes of transportation are prioritized here in Rhode Island? And they also mentioned specifically vehicle reduction and environmental equity in their question.
Somebody's going to jump in here. I would just say the infrastructure bill, of course, is a great unknown. We don't know if it'll pass in any form or even in half of its proposed size. Unfortunately, the parts that are likely to survive are the ones on highways and bridges. And I agree with the question that pedestrian facilities are always an afterthought, almost always an afterthought. It's going to take a major revision, and I think the Biden administration is making good noises on this, and I think they really need to be followed up on.
Yeah, if I could just add, we've clearly heard from the new Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, that indeed these priorities are going to be pushed hard. But then we get back down to how they get pushed through the state and then down to the local level. And I think that's where people really need to engage. If you have a federal government saying, well, we want to see different transportation systems emerge, the conflict at the local level can be a bit challenging because people have set ideas about what streets are for. And we've seen this in Providence, just how challenging it was with the bike lane conversation. So I think it's a great opportunity for engagement on all levels for us to get out and start to support the policies that are going to be coming. It can get blocked at the state level too. Someone threw in a chat point about the current leadership at Rhode Island DOT. So, you know, we have to work at all levels. And again, back to federalism, cooperative federalism.
If you guys don't mind if I jump in for a quick sec, I think 2 things that are exciting. One is, and I feel like I'm always plugging this, but TNC works with the Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank on the Municipal Resilience Program. And part of what makes that great is that then cities and towns, we go town by town and help them do workshops and planning efforts related to climate resilience. And a lot of that is developing kind of a list of projects for natural, like nature-based solutions and like natural climate solutions or nature-based infrastructure or green infrastructure. And so then they have kind of this like list of projects. So then as federal funds become available or as non-federal funds, other sources of funding become available, they're better able to tap those resources and bring them to their city and town. And sometimes those are FEMA funds, sometimes those are NOAA funds. The town of Westerly has done a really amazing job like using their municipal resilience plan now to go out and attract federal funds. So as we see these big pots potentially become available, having a plan is important. And I think that's the other reason why it's exciting to see Act on Climate finally pass is, you know, if the state has a plan and that plan includes all sorts of things, hopefully about bike and walkability and natural climate solutions and all of the things that I think we think of collectively as infrastructure, like then we have a plan and we can like go after some of the funding sources that come in. But right now it's not, there's no collective, you know, list or, you know, initiative out there to help prepare us to go out and do that. And I think Senator Whitehouse, I think I saw Karen Bradbury on the call, but I think Senator Whitehouse has done such a good job of saying, you know, we really need a plan to be able to then go out and be competitive for these types of resources.
Just to add one sentence to Sue's point, no agency's been more resource constrained or had less resources recently than statewide planning. Ken Payne and I remember a day when that agency was a strong planning agency that could do a lot of what Sue just talked about.
I too would like to jump in on this question. And I'm going to do it with the 3 L's. The first L is legs. You have to be able to walk on the sidewalks to get to the bus stop. Then you have to have a bus system of bus routes that is provides circulation within the community. Right now, what we really have is a hub and spoke system. Providence is the hub and then it shoots out, right? It doesn't have good loops within areas. What it has is a hub and spoke system. And then you need links between the loops. So we need to have reconceptualized the whole thing as legs first, make sure our sidewalks are in good condition, loops next, and then links between the loops.
I want to jump in.
Last week,
Sorry.
I walked what's the main street in my town, which is Princeton Road, Main Street, from Town Hall to the Wood River in Richmond, Rhode Island. And it was sad. For about 2 miles of this 2.8 mile stretch, there were no sidewalks at all. Then the sidewalks were basically under repair where the exit with Route 95 was being repaired. And then they were in sort of semi-rubble condition thereafter. I'm pretty able-bodied, but if you take somebody who's handicapped, that's an utterly unusable system. So even though you could theoretically get to a bus stop at the 95 intersection, it's very difficult to do it on your legs.
So our one thing that you all mentioned was the importance of having a plan to obtain some of this federal money. And one of the questions I was asked, I think this was Seth Handy, thank you, Seth, is how do we coordinate to make sure that this federal money is coming to Rhode Island and going to the right project? So what can we as advocates or state officials, I think we have a few state officials on the phone, do to make sure that that money is coming into Rhode Island and going to good places?
Get a hold of the tip. Make sure things get into the tip, the Transportation Improvement Program, and make sure your tip's aligned with your SIP, State Implementation Plan for Air Quality.
Yeah,
SIP aligned with SIP.
That speaks to a lot of what I was referring to and didn't want to go into depth about during my talk, but there's these layers of federal monies and how they come in, and they have to be coordinated with the plans that are local. And there needs to be much greater transparency. I'm afraid it's pretty off-putting to the everyday person. So a lot of what Sue just talked about is really important. These MRP efforts and something maybe bigger eventually in Providence or the larger Providence Metro, because some of this stuff is bigger than just at one city scale. So you got to think regionally on it. But I'm going to stop there and go back to my point about statewide planning.
I do welcome the inclusion of this point, because I think really hanging over a lot of the legislative decisions to come is how much latitude to give to individual states. You're already beginning to see this in some of the congressional deliberations. And even if we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars, it's not going to be enough to meet every potential need. I was in a long conversation this morning with a reporter asking, is $174 billion for EV subsidies sufficient? And my reaction is no, probably tip of the iceberg. If we're all going to be driving EVs within 10 or 15 years, and then deal with the environmental justice issues to make sure that people who have never bought a new car in their lives are somehow also going to get an EV out of that. It's just staggering. And so I think the opportunity here for states, certainly Rhode Island, my goodness, my own state, which has massive infrastructure issues, is going to be hugely resistant to many of the key provisions, especially if they're threatening to the internal combustion engine, which is just part and parcel. And we're already seeing union opposition to some of these things. Is what would actually work for a given state so that you can then go to a congressional session and be really credible and recognize that there's not going to be just unlimited pots of money. I don't see much of that happening in a great many states, and I think that is a huge opportunity. I also think another reason why that's important, this is not a permanent, dedicated, ongoing set of funding. This is an expenditure that's being proposed for a year or two and hopefully will be sustained over time and that no future Congress will tinker with. But it's unlike what Rhode Island has done with Reggie, where you set up a dedicated fund that keeps on going. It's shorter term. And so there's going to be tremendous pressure on the federal government and states to spend really fast, like speed of light right now. That doesn't usually work very well for lots and lots of reasons. And so all the more reason for states to be upping their game and getting ready, deciding what they are going to spend, but what they aren't going to try to pursue and invest in if there's not support for it.
Thanks, Barry. And we are almost at the hour, but I will give one small question that I hope can be answered more quickly, which is from Sunrise Worcester, who wonders that the Massachusetts climate bill and Rhode Island also just passed climate bills that set or double down on climate targets. Timmons mentioned how sometimes bills are passed without flexibility to be updated for latest science. Does it seem like the administration and legislatures who passed these bills will be willing to be flexible or update the targets in the future? And so this is a question for Timmons. And before we go to Timmons, I'll say that this climate bill that just passed in Massachusetts was an update of a past bill from 2008. So I think we are seeing that in the right circumstances, the very rare circumstances, then occasionally legislators can be pushed to update bills, but it took a long time and a lot of activism.
Yeah, I think the main point is the problem with, Massachusetts slipped behind. Everybody else has slipped behind. We've got to build structures into these bills to have much more incremental feedback loop between the science and the legislation. But the policy, what's available, what technology is possible, and what can be done.
So a way to do that is to have an authorization in the bill that the administrative agency, if it finds that a certain level of harm would otherwise occur, can undertake rulemaking and then make a decision based on that rule to update plans that would be used for program administration. So I think it's very fine-tuned and precise language around granting some rulemaking authority would be a way to address that question.
So that is our time, and thank you all so much for attending. Again, this session was recorded and we will send it around with all of the materials that were mentioned by email afterwards. And a big thanks to CACRI, especially Paul Roselli, for putting this together, and to our attendees for joining our panelists who gave fantastic presentations this afternoon. And livableri.org is the website of CACRI, where you can find all of our materials.